Chapter 1. I don't like this house. Sometimes in that hazy space between sleep and wakefulness, I would hear the sound from the attic. Soft creaks, faint shuffling, like someone up there breathing in the darkness. But I always told myself it was just the wind. Until that night, in the summer of 2005, my family moved into an old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. My dad, Lucian, my mom, Meredith, my older brother, Silas, my little sister, Delilah, and me, Ophelia. 14 years old, stuck in the middle of my teenage years, ripped away from the city, cut off from the internet. And from the moment I stepped into that house, something about it felt wrong. Our home stood in the center of a vast cornfield. It had been abandoned for years, or so we were told. When my dad said, "This place will be good for us," I could see the hope in his eyes. But I didn't share it. That first night, while Delilah and I were setting up our room, I glanced out the window. Something moved in the field. A shadow. But when I blinked and looked again, it was gone. The first strange thing happened that very night. Our family dog, Jasper, wouldn't stop barking. It was sometime after midnight, and his frantic yelping echoed through the house. Silas stumbled out of his room, still half asleep. Then Dad, they both went outside to check. And suddenly, Jasper went silent, as if someone had flipped a switch. Then I heard my dad's voice. "Oh God." I ran outside, my heart pounding. Jasper was lying on the ground, completely still. His eyes were open, but empty. No blood. No wounds. Nothing. He was just dead. The vet later said it might have been a heart attack. But Jasper had been healthy, strong. Delilah cried until morning. After that night, something about the air around the house changed. The silence felt heavier, like something was watching us. And for the first time, I truly listened to those faint noises I had been ignoring. The soft shuffling sounds coming from the attic, like something living up there. Chapter 2. Eyes in the Field. After Jasper's death, things on the farm started getting strange. Dad kept insisting it was just a coincidence, but Mom could barely sleep at night. Delilah would just sit by Jasper's empty bed, staring at the floor, not saying a word. But the worst part was what happened to Silas. My brother, the strong one, the one who used to tease me and act like nothing could faze him, he changed. He stopped sleeping at night, and when he did show up at breakfast, the dark circles under his eyes made him look like a ghost. At first, I thought it was just grief over Jasper, but then, one night, I saw him standing outside my door. It was past midnight. Delilah had already fallen asleep, and I was tossing and turning in bed. Then suddenly, I saw the shadow of feet beneath my door. A quiet, raspy voice broke the silence. "Are you awake?" It was Silas, but his voice sounded off, strained. I sat up quickly and opened the door. He was standing there in the dark hallway, his skin slick with sweat, his eyes wide and frantic. "What's wrong?" I whispered. He stared at me for a long moment. Then, in the softest voice, he said, "There's someone in the field, Ophelia." At first, I didn't understand what he meant. But then, he grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the window. We both looked out into the cornfield. At first, I saw nothing, just endless rows of tall, swaying stalks. But then Silas pointed to a spot between them, and that's when I saw them. A pair of eyes, deep in the darkness, barely visible between the stalks. Two pale, glowing orbs stared back at us, unmoving, watching. My stomach twisted. "An animal?" I whispered. Silas shook his head. "I saw them last night, too." His voice trembled. We stood there, frozen, staring back at those eyes. And then, after a few minutes, they were gone. Like they had never been there at all. But after that night, I started seeing them too. Every single night. A week later, that morning, we woke up to the sound of Mom screaming. We ran downstairs, following her voice to the barn. And there, in the middle of the hay-covered floor, we saw Bella, one of our biggest cows, lying completely still, just like Jasper. Her eyes were wide open, but her body had no wounds, no scratches, no sign of struggle. It was like something had just taken the life out of her. Dad immediately called the police. Within 10 minutes, a patrol car pulled up. The officer who stepped out was an older man with tired eyes. His badge read Officer Garrett. Garrett stood over Bella's body for a long time, saying nothing. He took a few pictures, then pulled a notepad from his pocket and turned to Dad. "Have you noticed anything strange around here before this?" Dad hesitated, then shook his head. But Silas stepped forward. "There's someone in the cornfield," he said. The officer looked up, studying my brother carefully. "What do you mean?" Silas took a deep breath and told him everything. The glowing eyes in the field, the strange noises at night, and Jasper's death. Garrett stayed quiet for a long moment. Then, with a slight nod, he muttered, "This place has been empty for a long time." He glanced toward the field. "No one's lived here in years, but..." He hesitated. His eyes lingered on the swaying corn, as if something inside it might be listening. Then, in a low voice, he added, "Did you know the previous owner disappeared?" Dad paled. "No," he said. "What happened to him?" Garrett exhaled, still staring at the field. "No one knows," he said. "One morning, he just vanished." And at that moment, I understood. Whatever was here before us, it was still here, watching, waiting. And it wasn't done yet. Chapter 3. Whispers from the Attic. After the police left, Dad tried to brush it all off. "You don't need to be scared of old stories," he said. But at dinner that night, no one believed him. Delilah put her spoon down and whispered, "Are we going to disappear too?" Mom immediately grabbed her hand. "Don't be silly, sweetheart," she said, but her voice was shaking. Silas didn't say a word. He just stared blankly at the table. And that's when I realized none of us were going to sleep that night. It was well past midnight. There was an uneasy stillness in the house. The kitchen cabinets creaked, the wind rattled against the wooden walls. But beneath all those noises, there was something else, a faint rustling sound, coming from the attic. At first, I thought it was just mice. But then the whispers started. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew one thing for sure: something was up there, and it was speaking. I got out of bed, slowly opening my door. Silas was already in the hallway. He had heard it too. We both knew there was no point in running anymore. We had to go up there. I followed Silas up the attic steps, clutching a flashlight in my hand. We stopped at the door, exchanging a quick glance. Silas took a deep breath and pushed it open. The air was thick and stale, dust swirling in the dim light. Wooden boards groaned beneath our feet as I swept the flashlight across the room. A few old chairs, some covered mirrors, stacks of forgotten boxes. But then we saw something that didn't belong. A bed. An actual bed. Just sitting there. The sheets were filthy and torn, a thin, ragged blanket draped over them. Next to the bed crushed empty cans of food. And beneath it, a pair of old, dirty shoes. Silas looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "Someone lives up here," he whispered. And right at that moment, something moved in the shadows. I swung the flashlight toward it. The door of an old wardrobe stood slightly ajar, just enough for us to see what was inside. Someone was in there, watching us. A pair of bloodshot eyes stared back through the crack in the door. Then, from the darkness inside the wardrobe, a raspy, wheezing voice whispered, "I'm done hiding." and with a sudden violent force, the wardrobe door swung open. Chapter 4: The Man in the Attic. When the wardrobe door flew open, it felt like all the air had been sucked from the room. There, crouched in the shadows, was a man. He was gaunt, his bones pressing against his skin as if he hadn't eaten in weeks. His hair was matted, his complexion a sickly shade of pale. But the worst part were his eyes, bloodshot, wide, trembling with madness. And those eyes locked directly onto mine. "I'm done hiding," he repeated, his voice hoarse and ragged, like he hadn't spoken in years. Silas' hand clamped onto my arm. We were frozen, but the moment the man moved, my brain screamed one thing: run. Silas yanked me backward, and we bolted for the door. A scream erupted behind us, but it didn't sound human. It was raw, guttural, like a wounded animal. We flew down the attic stairs so fast that I slipped, crashing onto my knees. The pain barely registered. I scrambled up and sprinted after Silas. By the time we reached the hallway, Mom and Dad had already burst from their room. "What the hell is going on?" Dad shouted. Silas, breathless, pointed toward the attic. "There's someone up there." And right then, the attic door slammed open. The man crawled down the stairs on all fours like an animal. His eyes bulged, his mouth hung open, his breath came in short, ragged gasps. And then he began to chant, "This house is mine. This house is mine. It's always been mine." Dad shoved us behind him and grabbed the nearest thing he could. "Find a baseball bat. Get the hell out of my house," he roared. But the man didn't stop. Mom was already on the phone with the police, her voice shaking. "Someone's in our house. Please send help, hurry." The man took a step toward Dad, and Dad, without a second of hesitation, swung. The bat connected with a sickening crack. The man crumpled to the floor, but he got up within seconds, as if he didn't feel pain at all. And then he did something unexpected. He smiled and whispered, "You found me, but there are more." That's when we heard it. Another sound from the attic. A deeper, heavier breath. Like something else was still up there. Right then, the wail of sirens filled the air. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows. The man suddenly recoiled, dropping to his knees and clutching his head like a wild animal sensing a trap. Officer Garrett and 2 other cops stormed in, guns drawn. "Hands up," one of them shouted, but the man let out an ear-piercing shriek and scrambled back up toward the attic. The officers chased after him, and a few minutes later, they had him in cuffs. But there was only one man. Had he lied? Or had they simply not found the other? A few days later, as we packed up to leave, Dad was sifting through old newspapers. He found an article. It was about a man who had lived in this farmhouse years ago. A man who had vanished without a trace.